For more than 4,000 years, one question has followed the Great Pyramid of Egypt everywhere it goes. How on earth was it built? Not by aliens, not by some lost supernatural power, not by a vanished civilization with secret technology. The honest answer, the one the evidence actually supports, is at once far more ordinary and far more astonishing than any of that. It was built by people. Ordinary people, with copper tools and rope and wood and ramps, and an almost unimaginable amount of patient, organized collective effort. And the more you understand about how they did it, the more remarkable it becomes, not less. Tonight we are going to walk through the whole thing, slowly and gently, from the cutting of the very first block to the setting of the last stone at the summit. How the stone was quarried, how it was moved, how it was lifted, how the whole vast thing was made to line up with the stars. And I promise to leave you at the end, not with a mystery to worry over, but with a quiet sense of wonder at what people were able to do so very long ago with their hands. But before we go a step further, let me ask you something softly, because it matters more than you might think. If these quiet journeys through the great stories of the past help you set down the weight of your day and find your way toward rest, then please take just a moment right now before you settle any deeper into the warm and subscribe. It is one small tap, but it means the next of these will find its way back to you on some future restless night when sleep is a long way off and you need somewhere gentle to put your mind. And it helps, more than you could possibly know, to keep these stories being made, for you and for everybody else out there in the dark tonight, looking for a little peace. So if you would, subscribe and stay with me, night after night, as we wander together through the great slow stories of how our world came to be. And tell me, if you will, from wherever you happen to be resting tonight, in whatever quiet corner of the world is holding you, where are you listening from? And what hour has it reached where you are? Leave it in the comments below. It is a lovely thing to see all the places and all the hours gathered there together, all of us drifting off beneath the same turning sky, in 100 different countries and 100 different hours, all of us here in the dark at once. And now, let your shoulders come down, and let your breathing slow, and let the whole weight of your day loosen and fall away. Come with me back across 4,500 years to a bend in a great river where a low limestone plateau looks out over the desert, and the largest building the world would know for thousands of years is about to begin. Let us begin with the thing itself, because it is easy to say the words Great Pyramid and never quite feel the size of it. The Great Pyramid was built around 4,500 years ago as a tomb for a king we now call Khufu, and for nearly 4,000 years after it was finished, it remained the tallest structure made by human hands anywhere on Earth. Think about that. Not the tallest of its time, the tallest for 4,000 years. No building anywhere surpassed it until the great cathedrals of Europe began to raise their spires, and even then it was a close thing. It stood originally about 146 meters high. That is roughly the height of a modern building of 40 or 50 floors. It is made of somewhere around 2.5 million blocks of stone. The blocks are not small. On average, each one weighs about 2.5 tons, which is more than a large car, and some of the blocks deep inside, the ones lining the most important chambers, weigh far more than that, up to 50 or 60 tons each, 2.5 million of them. If you tried to count the blocks, one every second, without ever stopping to eat or sleep, it would take you the better part of a month just to reach the end of the counting. And while most of those blocks weigh a couple of tons, the ones that really stop you are the giants, hidden deep inside. Above the king's burial chamber, the builders placed enormous granite beams to carry the tremendous weight of the stone piled above, and some of these single beams weigh as much as 50 or 60 tons each. That is the weight of a dozen elephants in one block of granite, quarried hundreds of kilometers away, floated down the river, hauled up onto the rising pyramid, and set into place high above the ground, with a precision that has held the ceiling of that chamber up for 4,500 years without it collapsing. When you consider that they did this not once, but for many such beams, lifting weights that would challenge a large modern crane, and placing them exactly deep inside a structure and high off the ground, the achievement moves from impressive to almost dizzying. And here is another way to feel the mass of it. It has been worked out that the stone in the Great Pyramid, if you broke it all up and built a wall of it, A modest wall about the height of a person and the width of your hand would be long enough to stretch a very great distance indeed, further than many entire countries are wide. All of that material gathered into a single pointed mountain on one small plateau. The pyramid is not really a building in the way we usually mean the word. It is very nearly a small mountain that human beings decided to assemble, block by block on purpose. And the base of it is very nearly a perfect square, covering an area large enough to hold several football pitches side by side. The four sides are aligned with extraordinary precision to the 4 points of the compass, to north and south and east and west, so accurately that the error is a tiny fraction of a single degree. And the base is not only square but very nearly level, the whole enormous footprint flat to within a couple of finger widths across its entire width, which is a feat of surveying so fine that it would challenge builders today. We will come back to how they managed the alignment, because it is one of the most beautiful parts of the whole story. So that is the object. A mountain of shaped stone, more than 2 million blocks, rising as high as a skyscraper, its base almost perfectly square and almost perfectly aligned to the heavens, built 45 centuries ago by people who had no iron, no wheels that were any use for this, no pulleys as we know them, and no machines of any kind. Rest a moment on that and let the sheer scale of it settle, because the wonder of tonight is not in any single trick. It is in the accumulation. 2.5 million times, someone had to cut, move, and place a block of stone. The question of how the pyramid was built is really 2.5 million smaller questions, each one answered by human hands. Let us start where the pyramid started, with the stone. Most of the pyramid is made of limestone, and here is the first piece of good fortune and the first piece of good planning. The plateau the pyramid stands on is itself made of limestone, so the builders did not have to bring most of the stone from far away. They quarried it right there on the spot, often only a few hundred meters from where the pyramid was rising. The main quarry has been found just to the south of the Great Pyramid, a great horseshoe-shaped bite taken out of the bedrock, from which a huge volume of stone was removed, roughly matching the volume of the pyramid itself. So, for the bulk of the building, the great mass of ordinary blocks that make up the core, the stone came from a few minutes' walk away. That single fact removes a great deal of the supposed mystery. They were not hauling millions of blocks across the desert. They were cutting them from the ground beside the building site and moving them a short distance. But how do you cut a block of limestone cleanly without iron tools? Limestone, luckily, is a fairly soft rock, especially when it is freshly quarried and still holds some moisture from the ground. The Egyptians cut it using tools of copper and later of bronze, along with a great deal of pounding with harder stones. To free a block, the workers would cut channels around it, deep grooves in the rock, wide enough for a man to crouch in and work. You can still see these channels in the quarries today, the marks of the tools clear in the stone, the exact width of the trench that a single worker's body needed. Once the block was outlined by channels on its sides, it had to be broken free from the bedrock underneath. And for this, there is good evidence that they used a beautifully simple technique. They cut a row of slots into the rock beneath the block and drove in wooden wedges and then soaked the wedges with water. The wood, absorbing the water, would swell with slow and enormous force, and that swelling would crack the stone along the line of the slots, splitting the block free from the bed below. Think about the patience in that. You cannot rush it. You set your wedges, you wet them, and you wait through the heat of the day for the wood to do its slow work. And in the cool of the evening you come back and the stone has cracked along exactly the line you wanted. Water and wood and time, splitting a mountain into blocks. And this tells you something about the whole enterprise that is easy to miss. So much of it depended not on force, but on knowledge, on knowing that wet wood swells, on knowing that soft limestone cuts more easily fresh from the ground, on knowing which way the stone would split and where its natural weaknesses lay, so that the channels and wedges could be placed to work with the rock rather than against it. The quarrymen were not simply strong. They were skilled in a craft passed down and refined over generations, and every block that came cleanly away from the bedrock was a small act of expertise, not just of labor. You can still stand in those quarries today and see the evidence of it. The half-finished cuts, The channels abandoned partway through, perhaps because a flaw appeared in the stone. The clean beds where good blocks were lifted away. It is like reading the notes of the workers directly. 4,500 years later, the marks of their tools and their decisions still fresh in the rock, as though they had set down their tools only yesterday and walked home for the evening. The harder stones, the granite used for the most important inner chambers, came from much further away, from quarries hundreds of kilometers to the south, near a place called Aswan. Granite is far harder than limestone, too hard to cut with copper at all. For that they used pounding stones of an even harder rock, balls of dolerite, with which teams of workers would batter the granite hour after hour, day after day, slowly pulverizing channels into it, shaping the enormous blocks by sheer relentless force. It was brutally slow work, and they did it anyway, because the king's burial chamber was to be lined with granite. And so granite it would be, however long it took and however far it had to come. And then that granite had to travel those hundreds of kilometers to reach the pyramid. And here the great river that runs through Egypt did the heavy lifting. The Nile was the highway of the ancient world, and every year it flooded, spreading out across the land, and the builders used that flood. Enormous blocks of granite, some weighing many tons, were loaded onto wooden barges at the southern quarries and floated down the river, carried by the current all the way to the plateau. The Egyptians timed the great deliveries to the flood season, when the risen waters came closest to the building site, so that the stone had the shortest possible distance to travel over land at the end. We even have a remarkable window into how this worked, because a few years ago, archaeologists found the diary of one of the officials involved in the building of the Great Pyramid written on papyrus, the oldest inscribed papyrus ever found. In it, a man records the work of his team, hauling limestone by boat from a quarry across the river to the pyramid site, journey after journey, over the course of months. It is an ordinary logbook, a foreman keeping track of his crew's deliveries, and it is 4,500 years old, and it describes in plain administrative detail the transport of the very stones that make up the pyramid. To read it is to hear the voice of someone who was actually there, doing the work, keeping the records, on the greatest building project of the ancient world. Now we come to the part everyone wonders about. Once you have your block, cut free and shaped, how do you move something that weighs as much as a car or a small truck, when you have no engines and no proper wheels? The answer, on the ground, is the sledge. A simple wooden sledge, a kind of large sled with runners, onto which the block was levered and lashed. Teams of men would then haul the sledge with ropes, dragging it across the ground. You might wonder why they did not simply use wheels, since the wheel was known in the ancient world. But wheels are of little use for this kind of work. A wheel needs a hard, smooth, prepared road to run on, or it sinks and jams, and a small wheel under a massive block would dig straight into the ground. On soft or sandy terrain, dragging a load on broad sledge runners is actually far more practical than rolling it on wheels, which is why heavy things were moved on sledges in Egypt long after the wheel was familiar. The builders were not ignorant of the wheel. They had simply worked out correctly that for hauling many tons of stone across the desert ground, a sledge and a rope and many strong arms were the better tool. And those ropes themselves were a real feat. Moving these loads required rope of great strength, in enormous quantities, and the Egyptians made it by hand from plant fibers, twisting and braiding it into cables thick and strong enough to take the strain of many men pulling a stone that weighed as much as a house. Miles upon miles of rope, made by hand for a single building. Even the humble rope that bound it all together was the product of patient, skilled, endless human work. And here the Egyptians knew a trick that was lost to us for a long time, until a wonderful piece of evidence turned up. If you drag a heavy sledge across dry sand, the sand piles up in front of the runners, and the whole thing digs in and becomes impossibly hard to pull. But if you wet the sand, just the right amount, something changes. The damp sand becomes firm and smooth, the grains sticking together, and the sledge glides across it with far less effort. Wet the sand too much and it turns to mud. Get it just right, and you roughly halve the number of men needed to pull the load. And we are not guessing about this. There is a painting from an Egyptian tomb that shows an enormous statue being dragged on a sledge by rows of men, and standing at the front of the sledge, right by the runners, is a man pouring water onto the sand from a jar. For a long time, nobody was quite sure what he was doing or assumed it was some ritual gesture, a symbolic offering. Now we understand. He was the man whose job it was to keep the sand at exactly the right dampness, the difference between a load that moved and a load that would not budge. A small figure with a water jar painted onto a wall 3,500 years ago, quietly holding one of the keys to how the pyramids were built. And modern scientists have actually tested this, out of curiosity, and confirmed it. They measured how much force it takes to pull a heavy sledge across dry sand and then across damp sand, and found that the right amount of moisture can roughly halve the effort required. The reason is that a little water makes the grains of sand cling together and stay firm, forming a smooth, hard surface, instead of piling up and giving way. Too little water and the sand is loose. Too much and it turns to sticky mud. But at just the right dampness, the sand becomes almost like a solid road, and the sledge glides. The ancient Egyptians had discovered, and were relying on, a piece of physics that we only measured properly in laboratories in recent years. They did not have the equations, but they had the knowledge, learned by doing, passed from worker to worker, and it worked just as well without the mathematics. Rest a moment on that image, because I find it a lovely one. Not a machine, not a secret. A man with a jar of water wetting the sand in front of the sledge so that the great stone would slide. That is the level at which this was solved. Clever, patient, human solutions to each problem in turn. Now, moving a block across level ground is one thing, but a pyramid is not level ground. The whole point of it is that it goes up, higher and higher, 146 meters into the sky. So the real question, the one that has generated more argument than any other, is this. How did they lift 2.5 million blocks, some of them weighing many tons, to such enormous heights? And the answer almost certainly is ramps. But the details of the ramps are where it becomes truly interesting, because a single straight ramp, of the obvious kind, runs into a beautiful problem. Let us think it through gently the way the builders must have. To keep a ramp at a shallow enough slope that men could haul heavy sledges up it, the ramp cannot be too steep. But the pyramid grows very tall, and a long, shallow ramp reaching all the way to the top of a tall pyramid would have to be enormously, impossibly long. In fact, a single straight ramp reaching the summit of the Great Pyramid at a workable slope would need to be well over 1 kilometer long and would itself contain more material than the pyramid. Building the ramp would be a bigger job than building the pyramid. So that cannot be the whole answer. So the builders must have been cleverer than that, and there are several ideas about how, and the truth is probably a combination of them, changing as the pyramid rose. For the lower part of the pyramid, where most of the volume is, a simple ramp may have worked well enough, because the pyramid is wide and low near the base, and a ramp there does not need to be very long or very tall. As much as 2/3 of all the stone in the pyramid sits in the bottom third of its height, so a relatively modest ramp could place the great majority of the blocks. This is a point worth pausing on, because it makes the whole thing feel more possible. We tend to imagine the difficulty of the pyramid as being the height, the terrible business of lifting stones 146 meters into the air. But because the pyramid is shaped the way it is, wide at the bottom and narrowing to a point, most of the work is not high up at all. The great bulk of the stone is placed low down in the broad lower courses, where lifting is easy. By the time you are working high up near the top, the pyramid has narrowed so much that there is very little stone left to place. So the hardest lifting, to the greatest heights, involves only a small fraction of the total blocks. The shape of the pyramid is in a sense its own solution. It puts nearly all of its weight where the weight is easiest to raise. But for the upper part, where a straight ramp becomes unwieldy, the leading idea is a ramp that wrapped around the pyramid itself. A ramp that spiraled up the outside, hugging the faces, climbing around and around the growing structure, rising with it. Such a ramp could stay at a gentle slope while reaching any height, because it simply wound around the four sides as many times as it needed to. There is real evidence for ramps like this, and the remains of such wrapping ramps have been found on other, unfinished pyramids and monuments, left in place because those buildings were never completed, and the ramps never dismantled. Some have even suggested that part of the ramp system may have run inside the pyramid in a corridor spiraling up within the body of the structure, so that blocks could be hauled upward through the interior as it rose. It is an intriguing idea, and there are hints that might support it, though it remains debated. And that debate is itself worth noticing, because it reminds us that we do not have every answer. We know the broad shape of how it was done, the quarrying and the sledges and the ramps and the organization. But some of the finer details are still argued over by people who have spent their lives studying it, and new discoveries still shift the picture. The pyramid has not given up quite all of its secrets, even now, and there is something pleasing in that it still has a little mystery left of the honest kind, the kind that patient study may yet solve. And there is a third idea, and it is one of my favorites, because it was discovered quite recently, and it is so ingenious. At one of the granite quarries, archaeologists found the remains of a ramp with rows of post holes running up either side of it. The best explanation is that these held wooden posts, and that the posts were used as anchor points, with ropes wrapped around them, so that as one team hauled a block up the ramp, the posts acted like the fixed points of a pulley, letting the men multiply their effort and hold the load steady on the slope. A ramp, in other words, fitted with a system of ropes and posts to make the hauling far more effective. 4,500 years ago, they had worked out how to gain mechanical advantage on a slope, with nothing but timber and rope. Rest a moment there, because this is the heart of it. There was almost certainly no single method. There was a whole toolkit of methods, straight ramps and wrapping ramps and ramps with rope and post systems, used in different combinations at different stages, adapted as the pyramid grew and the problems changed. The builders were not following one secret trick. They were solving an evolving engineering problem, stage by stage, with intelligence and experience, exactly as good builders do today. And once a block reached its place, high on the growing pyramid, there was still the delicate work of setting it exactly right. It was not enough to get the stone up there. It had to be positioned precisely, its edges true, its top level, so that the next course could be laid evenly upon it. The builders used levers to nudge the heavy blocks that final small distance into position, easing them a finger's width this way or that until they sat perfectly. They checked their levels with simple but ingenious tools, plumb lines weighted with stone to find the vertical, and set squares to check the corners, and long straight edges to test that a surface was flat. There is something moving in the smallness of that final step. After all the grandeur of quarrying and hauling and raising, a block weighing more than a car brought all that way, and then 2 or 3 workers with wooden levers, gently, patiently, teasing it the last few centimeters into exactly the right spot, and checking it with a string and a stone weight, and only then moving on to the next. 2.5 million times. The pyramid is vast, but it was built up out of these tiny, careful, precise placements one at a time, each one done by hand, each one checked by eye. Now let us go inside the organization of it, because in some ways this is the greatest marvel of all, greater than any question of stone and rope. To build the Great Pyramid in the 20 or so years of a single king's reign, the builders would have had to quarry, move, and place a block roughly every few minutes all day, every day for 2 decades. That is the pace. A block set and another begun over and over for 20 years without pause, and every one of those blocks had to be cut in the right place, moved along the right path, and set down in exactly the right position at the right moment, so that the whole vast structure rose evenly and stayed true. Try to picture the building site at its busiest, and you begin to sense the scale of the coordination. Thousands upon thousands of people, all working at once, teams down in the quarry, splitting fresh blocks from the bedrock, teams hauling sledges along the prepared paths with their water carriers running ahead to wet the sand, teams on the ramps, straining at the ropes, easing blocks upward, teams at the top, levering each stone into its final place, scribes moving among them, keeping their records, overseers calling the rhythm, water carriers and food carriers threading through the crowd, tool makers mending the copper chisels that went blunt by the 100, all of it happening together, in step, hour after hour, a vast human machine of arms and ropes and timber and stone, and at the center of it the pyramid, rising course by course, a little higher each week. There was no room for the whole thing to fall into confusion, and yet it did not. Somehow, for 20 years, this enormous effort held together and stayed organized and kept its pace and rose true. That, more than the size of any single stone, is what should take your breath away. Not that they could lift a heavy block, anyone can imagine lifting a heavy block, but that they could keep tens of thousands of people moving in harmony toward a single distant goal for 2 decades and get it right. That requires organization on a scale that had never been attempted before in human history. It requires feeding, housing, and directing a workforce of tens of thousands. It requires quarrying stone hundreds of kilometers away and bringing it up the river at exactly the right time. It requires bakeries and breweries and granaries to feed the workers, and workshops to make and mend the tools, and scribes to record it all, and overseers to keep the whole immense machine moving in step. And here we should gently set aside one of the oldest and most stubborn myths about the pyramids, because the truth is both kinder and more impressive. For a very long time, people imagined the pyramids being built by vast armies of slaves, driven with whips, dying in their thousands. That picture, which comes largely from much later storytelling, appears to be simply wrong. The evidence now points to a workforce of skilled, paid, respected laborers. Some were permanent craftsmen, the expert stonemasons and engineers who stayed year-round. Many more were ordinary farmers who came to work on the pyramid during the flood season, when the river covered their fields and there was no farming to be done. Think about how neatly that fits. For part of every year the Nile flooded and the farmland vanished under water, and the farmers could not work their fields. And it was exactly then, during the flood, that the river rose high enough to float the great stones close to the site, and exactly then that a large body of workers became free to labor. The building of the pyramid was woven into the rhythm of the river and the seasons. The same flood that stopped the farming carried the stone and freed the hands to place it. It was, in a sense, a national project that the whole society took part in the season when the land itself paused and waited for the waters to fall, and the workers who died during the decades of building, as some inevitably did, in accidents or from the sheer hardness of the labor, were buried with honor, in their own tombs near the pyramid, provided with goods for the afterlife. Slaves are not buried with honor beside the king's own monument. These people were, which tells us how they were regarded. They were not the victims of the pyramid, they were its proud makers. And this, more than the ramps or the sledges, is the real answer to how the pyramids were built. They were built by organization, by the ability of an early society to gather an enormous number of people and resources and coordinate them toward a single goal for decades without the whole thing falling apart. That is the true technology on display here. Not a machine, but a way of organizing human beings, which was in its way just as much an invention as any engine. We now know a great deal about how that workforce was arranged, because the workers left their mark, quite literally. Deep inside the pyramid, in spaces that were never meant to be seen, hidden above the king's chamber, there are marks painted onto the stones by the work gangs. And those marks are the names the teams gave themselves. They organized into crews, and the crews had names, proud names, names like the Friends of Khufu and the Drunkards of Menkaure, painted onto the blocks they set. These were not the marks of slaves. They were the marks of teams who took pride in their work, who competed perhaps, who wanted their name on the stone they had placed. It is one of the most human things in the whole pyramid, these gang names daubed on hidden blocks, the ancient equivalent of workers signing their names in wet concrete. And we know how they were fed, because the remains of their town have been found just a short distance from the pyramids. Archaeologists have uncovered the bakeries with the great vats for mixing dough and the molds for the bread. They have found the remains of enormous quantities of bread and beer, the staple food and drink of the workers. They have found evidence that great numbers of cattle, sheep and goats were brought to the site and butchered, so that the workers, far from being starved, were eating meat regularly, which in the ancient world was a sign of being well provided for. The people who built the pyramid were fed well on purpose, because a well-fed workforce is a workforce that can do the impossible. Someone understood that 4,500 years ago and organized the feeding of a small city of workers to make it so. Now let us come to the most beautiful precision of all, the alignment with the stars, because this is where the builders reached beyond the merely practical and touched something like the sublime. The four sides of the Great Pyramid are aligned to the cardinal directions, to true north, south, east, and west, with an accuracy that is truly astonishing. The error is only a small fraction of a degree. Modern buildings, put up with every advantage of technology, are often less precisely aligned than this pyramid built 45 centuries ago. How did they do it? With no compass. A compass would not even have helped enough, because true north and magnetic north are not the same. They aligned it not to the Earth's magnetism, but to the sky itself. There are a few ideas about exactly how, and they are all lovely. One is that they watched a particular star, or pair of stars, circling the northern sky through the night, and found the point around which the stars appeared to turn, which marks true north. The stars, as the night passes, appear to wheel slowly around a single fixed point in the northern sky, the point that lies directly above the Earth's axis. A star rises in the east of that region, swings up and around and sets in the west, and if you carefully mark where it rises and where it sets, the exact line halfway between those points aims at true north. Watch patiently enough night after night, and the turning sky itself hands you the direction with great precision. Another idea is that they watched the sun and marked the shadow of a vertical pole through the day, finding the exact midpoint between the shadow's positions in the morning and the evening, which gives a true north-south line. In the morning, the shadow points one way, in the evening the other, and the line that splits the difference runs true north and south. Either way, they took their direction from the heavens, from the patient turning of the stars and the arc of the sun, and they wrote that celestial direction into the foundations of a mountain of stone so accurately that we still marvel at it today. And there is a subtle clue that supports the idea that they used the stars. The alignments of the Great Pyramids are not all off in random directions. The tiny errors in them seem to shift very slightly in a consistent way from the older pyramids to the younger ones. And that gradual shift matches the slow drift of the stars over the centuries, caused by the very slow wobble of the Earth on its axis. In other words, the small imperfections in the pyramid's alignments appear to record the position of the stars at the moment each one was built, like a faint date stamp written in the sky. If that is right, then the pyramids are not only aligned to the heavens, they are aligned to the heavens as they were on a particular night long ago, and they have kept that ancient sky frozen in stone ever since. Rest a moment on that, because it is worth holding gently as you drift. Imagine the astronomer priests in the still of the desert night, 4,500 years ago, watching the stars wheel slowly around the pole, marking their positions with careful sightings night after night, in order to find the one true line. And then imagine that line being handed to the builders and laid into the ground and followed upward through 2.5 million blocks, so that the finished mountain pointed with breathtaking accuracy at the axis of the turning sky. They wanted the king's monument to be squared to the cosmos itself, and they achieved it, with their eyes and their patience and their reverence, and it has held true for 45 centuries. And then at last the outside. Because the pyramid you picture, the rough brown stepped mountain of bare blocks that stands in the desert today, is not how it looked when it was finished. When it was new, the Great Pyramid was covered from base to peak in a smooth outer skin of fine white limestone, polished and fitted so precisely that the joints between the casing stones are barely thick enough to slide a knife into. The whole vast structure was sheathed in gleaming white, its four perfect triangular faces rising to a point, and in the Egyptian sun it would have shone, visible for many kilometers across the desert, a dazzling white mountain of light. And at the very top, crowning the whole structure, there was a capstone, a single pointed block that formed the peak, and it may have been covered in gold or a bright gold and silver alloy, so that the very tip of the pyramid caught the first light of the rising sun and the last light of the setting sun and blazed like a point of fire above the desert. Imagine that. A vast white mountain, its four faces gleaming, and at its summit a point of gold catching the sun. It must have looked less like a building than like something belonging to the heavens, set down on the earth. Most of that beautiful casing is gone now, taken away over the centuries to build other things, the fine white limestone stripped off to raise the walls and mosques of nearby cities, which is why we see the rough-stepped core beneath. But a little of it survives, at the base of one of the neighboring pyramids and here and there around the plateau, and where it survives, you can still see the astonishing smoothness of it, the tightness of the joints, the quality of the work. The casing stones fit together so closely that in places you cannot slide a blade between them, and this over surfaces of many tons, cut and dressed and set by hand. When it was whole, it must have been one of the most beautiful things human beings had ever made. Not a rough pile of stone at all, but a smooth, shining, perfect white peak, tipped with gold, gleaming above the desert, visible from a great distance. A thing to stop travelers in their tracks and make them stare. There is a real loss in the fact that we cannot see it as it was. The pyramid we know, brown and rough and stepped, is really the pyramid with its skin removed, its bare inner structure exposed. The thing the builders actually finished, the thing they meant us to see, was smooth and white and radiant, and almost no one alive has ever laid eyes on it. We have inherited the mountain, but not its gleam. Now let me gather the whole thing together, because when you lay the steps side by side, the supposed mystery quietly dissolves into a chain of human solutions. They quarried the stone right beside the site, splitting it from the bedrock with copper tools and wet wooden wedges. They shaped the blocks by hand. They floated the great granite blocks hundreds of kilometers down the river on the yearly flood. They moved them on wooden sledges across sand, kept damp at exactly the right point by a man with a water jar. They raised them with ramps, straight ones and spiraling ones, and ramps fitted with posts and ropes, changing the method as the pyramid grew. They levered each block into its final place and checked it with plumb line and square. They organized tens of thousands of workers and fed them well on bread and beer and meat, and housed them in a town beside the site and directed them for 20 years with a skill of coordination that was itself a kind of miracle. And they aligned the whole thing to the turning stars, with their eyes and their patience alone. And then they sheathed it in gleaming white limestone and capped it with gold. Not one part of that required anything beyond human hands and human minds, but all of it together, sustained for 2 decades, adds up to something that still stops us in our tracks 4,500 years later. And that, I think, is the real answer to how the pyramids were built. And it is a far more wonderful answer than any mystery. They were built by people. By people no different from us, with the same hands and the same minds, who happened to live very long ago, and who wanted, badly enough, to raise a mountain to the sky for their king, and who then worked out, patiently, problem by problem, exactly how to do it. There is a strange habit, when people look at the pyramids, of reaching for explanations that take the achievement away from human beings, as though the pyramid were too good for us, too grand, too precise, and must therefore have been the work of someone else, something else from somewhere else. But that gets it exactly backwards. To say that people could not have built the pyramids is not a compliment to the pyramids. It is a quiet insult to people, and it is also simply not true. We know in real detail how they were built because the evidence is all around them, in the quarries and the workers' town and the tools, and even in their written records. The story of the building is not a blank waiting to be filled with fantasy. It is a known thing and a human thing, and it is all the more wonderful for that. There is nothing in the Great Pyramid that demeans human beings by being beyond them. Quite the opposite. The pyramid is a monument to what people can do. It says, across 4,500 years, that ordinary human beings working together, with patience and cleverness and an enormous shared will, can build something that will outlast almost everything else they will ever make. That is not a mystery to be solved. It is an achievement to be honored. So let us come back now, gently, from the quarries and the ramps and the shining white peak, and let the whole thing settle into quiet. The people who built the pyramid are long gone now. The workers who split the stone and hauled the sledges and wet the sand, the scribes who counted the blocks, the astronomers who watched the stars to find true north, the king for whom it was all raised. All of them gone more than 4,000 years ago, their names mostly forgotten, their individual labors blended into the great silent mass of the thing they made. But the pyramid still stands. It has stood through everything. Through the fall of ancient Egypt itself, through the coming and going of empires beyond counting, through 4,500 years of days and nights. It has stood on its plateau above the river, squared to the stars exactly where they placed it. Almost everything else that the people of that age made has crumbled to dust. The pyramid remains, and there is something restful in that, I think, at the end of a long day. That patient, collective human effort can produce something so enduring that the small, careful labors of ordinary people, the wetting of sand, the setting of a block, the sighting of a star, can add up over years to a thing that stands for millennia. Nothing you do that is done with care is ever quite as small as it feels. The pyramid is made of 2.5 million small, careful acts, and it has lasted longer than nearly anything else on Earth. Every one of those acts was done by a person whose name we will almost certainly never know. The man who wet the sand. The woman who baked the bread that fed the haulers. The quarryman who set the wedges and waited for the wood to swell. The astronomer who stood in the cold desert night and watched a star swing around the pole to find true north. The crew who painted their proud name on a hidden block, wanting in some small way to be remembered. None of them knew they were making one of the wonders of the world. Each of them was simply doing their part of the work, on an ordinary day a very long time ago. And together, without any single one of them being able to see the whole of it, they made something that would outlast their language, their kingdom, their gods, and very nearly everything else the human race has ever built. There is a lesson in that, gentle enough to fall asleep on. That great things are made of small ones. That you do not need to see the whole of what you are part of to be part of something that lasts. That care and patience and the willingness to do your small piece well are how every enduring thing has ever been made. So let your breathing slow, and let the quarries fall quiet, and let the sledges come to rest, and let the great white peak gleam one last time in the setting sun of a day 4,500 years ago, and then let it fade softly into the dark. There is nothing here you need to carry. The work is long finished. The stones are all placed. The mountain is built, and it stands, and it will still be standing in the morning, and for many thousands of mornings after that, squared to the quiet turning of the stars, exactly as its builders meant it to be. Sleep now, and let the oldest of the world's great wonders keep its patient watch over the desert, as it has every night for 45 centuries, needing nothing from you, asking nothing of you, simply standing in the dark until the morning comes. For thousands of years, when people looked at the Great Pyramid, they asked the wrong question. They asked how. But there is a better question, a more human one, and it has a far more surprising answer. Who? Who actually built it? Whose hands? Whose backs? Whose lives went into this mountain of stone? For most of history, the answer people gave was a sad and simple one. Slaves, they said. Vast armies of slaves, whipped and starved, dying by the thousand to raise a monument for a cruel king. It is a powerful image, and it has been repeated for so long that most people simply assume it is true. But it is not true. The people who built the pyramids were not slaves. They were skilled, paid, respected, and remarkably well cared for. And we know a great deal about them now, more than we have ever known, because they left their traces everywhere. And we have finally learned to read them. Tonight we are going to meet them, the real people who built the Great Pyramid, not as a faceless mass, but as workers with names, with teams, with homes and meals and pride in their labor. And I think by the end, you will feel closer to them than to almost anyone else from so long ago, because the traces they left are so very human. But before we go a step further, let me ask you something softly, because it matters more than you might think. If these quiet journeys through the great stories of the past help you set down the weight of your day and find your way toward rest, then please take just a moment right now before you settle any deeper into the warm and subscribe. It is one small tap, but it means the next of these will find its way back to you on some future restless night, when sleep is a long way off and you need somewhere gentle to put your mind. And it helps, more than you could possibly know, to keep these stories being made, for you and for everybody else out there in the dark tonight, looking for a little peace. So if you would, subscribe and stay with me night after night as we wander together through the great slow stories of how our world came to be. And tell me, if you will, from wherever you happen to be resting tonight, in whatever quiet corner of the world is holding you. Where are you listening from, and what hour has it reached where you are? Leave it in the comments below. It is a lovely thing to see all the places and all the hours gathered there together. All of us drifting off beneath the same turning sky in 100 different countries and 100 different hours. All of us here in the dark at once. And now let your shoulders come down, and let your breathing slow, and let the whole weight of your day loosen and fall away. Come with me back across 4,500 years to a busy, dusty, crowded place beside a great river, and let us meet the people who built a wonder of the world. It is strange when you think about it, how completely these people had been forgotten. For thousands of years, everyone knew the pyramids. They were famous in the ancient world itself, already old and celebrated when the earliest historians wrote about them. And yet the people who actually built them had faded almost entirely from memory, reduced to a vague and mostly false idea of nameless slaves. The monument was remembered, and the king it was built for was remembered, but the hands that raised it were lost. It is only in recent times, through patient digging in the sand, that we have begun to give them back their names, their faces, their real lives. And that recovery is one of the quietly beautiful achievements of modern archaeology, this returning of identity to the forgotten builders of the most famous building on Earth. Let us begin with the myth, because we have to clear it away gently before we can see the truth, and it is worth understanding where it came from. The idea that slaves built the pyramids is very old, but it is not Egyptian. It comes mostly from much later writers, from Greek travelers who visited Egypt thousands of years after the pyramids were already ancient, and who wrote down the stories they were told, or that they imagined. And later still, the image was taken up and repeated, and it settled deep into the way the world pictures ancient Egypt. A land of god-kings and suffering slaves, of whips and chains and endless forced labor under a burning sun. It is a vivid picture, and when the modern study of Egypt began, and people first stood before the pyramids and tried to imagine building them, the slave story seemed to fit. How else, they thought, could you get so many people to do such crushing work? Surely only force could do it. There was also, in some tellings, a particular famous version of the story, in which the pyramids were built by enslaved people of a certain nation held in bondage in Egypt. That version comes from religious tradition written down long after the pyramids were built, more than 1,000 years after, in fact, and there is no archaeological evidence for it at all. The people it describes, whatever their history, have nothing to do with the raising of the pyramids, which were already ancient monuments, older than 1,000 years by the time those stories are set. The pyramids were old before the events of that tradition were even supposed to have happened, but the image was powerful, and it fused with the older Greek tales, and together they cemented the idea of the slave-built pyramid so firmly in the popular imagination that it has taken a mountain of evidence to begin shifting it. But as the real evidence came out of the ground, over the last century or so, and especially over the last few decades, that picture fell apart, because the ground around the pyramids does not tell a story of slavery. It tells a story of something much more organized, much more willing, and much more humane. And it is worth saying that the Egyptians themselves, in all their vast writings and carvings, never boasted of building the pyramids with slaves, never depicted it, never recorded it, which is telling because they recorded a great deal else and were not shy about showing captives and forced labor when it suited them. The slave story is something later ages laid upon the pyramids. It was never the Egyptians' own account of how their greatest works were made. And the first great clue was a discovery that took a long time to make, because for centuries everyone was looking at the pyramids themselves, and almost no one thought to ask a simpler question. Where did the workers live? A pyramid does not build itself, and it does not get built by people who vanish at the end of each day. Tens of thousands of workers had to live somewhere close to the site for decades. They had to sleep somewhere, eat somewhere, be fed and organized and looked after. And for a long time, nobody had found that place. The pyramids stood there, enormous and silent, and the people who built them seemed to have left no home behind. It is one of those questions that seems obvious once it is asked, and yet went unasked for a very long time. Everyone was so captivated by the pyramids themselves, by the puzzle of the stones and the height and the precision, that the simpler human question got overlooked. Where did the people sleep? Where did they cook? Where did they go at the end of a long day of hauling stone? A workforce that size is a small city in itself, and a city leaves traces if you only think to look for them and look in the right place. The breakthrough came when archaeologists began to think less about the monuments and more about the lives around them. If you want to understand how the pyramids were built, they reasoned, do not only study the pyramids, study the people. Find where they lived, find where they ate and worked, and were buried. And when they turned their attention to the sand around the plateau, to the unglamorous ground where no tourist ever looked, the lost world of the builders began to come up out of the earth. And then, a few decades ago, archaeologists digging in the sand a short distance from the pyramids found it. A whole town, a lost city of the pyramid builders, buried and forgotten for 4,500 years, right there beside the monuments it had raised. And it was not a squalid huddle of huts either. It was a planned settlement, laid out with intention. There were long galleries that appear to have been sleeping quarters, arranged in orderly rows, where workers could rest in shifts. There were larger houses that likely belonged to the supervisors and officials. There were streets and drainage and communal spaces. There were storerooms and workshops. It was, in short, a proper town designed and built to house and support a great workforce, with the kind of organization behind it that you see in a settlement meant to function smoothly for many years. The scale of it speaks of careful planning by people who knew exactly what they were doing. Someone sat down before or during the great work and thought about where the workers would sleep, and how they would be fed, and how the bread would be baked and the beer brewed and the tools mended, and the whole small city kept running. The town is not just where the builders lived. It is itself a piece of evidence about how thoroughly the whole enterprise was thought through, from the greatest question of how to raise a mountain of stone down to the humblest question of where a tired worker would lay his head at night. Rest a moment on that, because it is a wonderful thing to picture. For thousands of years, travelers had come to marvel at the pyramids and walked right over the buried homes of the very people who built them without ever knowing they were there. The workers had not vanished at all. Their whole world was still there under the sand waiting, and what that buried town revealed changed everything we thought we knew about who these people were. Let us walk through it gently and see how they lived. The first thing the town revealed was food on an enormous scale, and the kind of food matters a great deal. Archaeologists found the remains of very large bakeries, with rows of great pottery molds for baking bread, enough to feed thousands. They found evidence of brewing on a similar scale because beer, thick and nourishing, was a staple drink of ancient Egypt, as much a food as a drink. Bread and beer, in enormous quantities, the fuel of the workforce. The bread was baked in tall pottery molds set among the embers, and it was hearty and dense, the kind of thing that fills a working body and keeps it going through a long day of heavy labor. The beer was not much like what we drink today. It was thick, almost a liquid food, mildly alcoholic, full of nourishment, and it was drunk by everyone, a basic ration rather than a luxury. Between them, bread and beer formed the foundation of every worker's diet, handed out as rations day after day, the steady fuel that kept the whole enormous effort in motion. And they found fish too, and evidence of many other foods, so that the diet was not only ample but varied. This was a workforce that ate a real and balanced diet, provided reliably, in quantity, every single day, for decades. Feeding tens of thousands of people, day after day, year after year, is itself a staggering logistical achievement, one that required its own small army of bakers and brewers and cooks and porters, all working to keep the builders fed so that the builders could keep the pyramid rising. The kitchens of the pyramid were in their way as essential as the quarries, but it was not only bread and beer. They found something that told a much richer story. They found bones, great numbers of animal bones, from cattle, from sheep, from goats. And when they counted and studied them, they realized that the workers were eating meat, and not scraps of it, but good meat regularly. It has been estimated that enough cattle and other animals were brought to the site to provide the workforce with meat many times a week. This is not how you feed slaves. You do not drive enormous herds of cattle across the land to give prime beef to people you are working to death. Meat, in the ancient world, was precious. To give it to your workers, in quantity, week after week, is to say that those workers matter, that they are worth feeding well, that their strength is worth maintaining. The bones in the workers' town are, in their quiet way, one of the strongest arguments against the whole slave story. These people were fed like valued laborers because that is what they were. And the meat came from far away, from herds raised across the country and sent to the pyramid as a kind of national contribution, so that the whole land was, in a sense, feeding the people who built the king's monument. Villages far from the pyramids raised the cattle that fed the workers. The building of the pyramid reached out across the entire kingdom and drew in food and labor and materials from everywhere, and the workers stood at the center of that great flow, well provided for. This is worth pausing on because it changes how you see the whole thing. The pyramid was not just a building project, it was a great engine that reached into every corner of the kingdom and pulled resources toward a single point. Grain from the fields of the river valley, baked into bread and brewed into beer. Cattle from distant pastures driven to the site to feed the workers. Timber for the sledges and the ramps. Copper for the tools, mined and smelted and shaped. Fine stone from quarries near and far. Rope and pottery and cloth, and all the countless things a small city of workers needs. All of it flowing in, year after year, organized and directed to keep the great work moving. And that flow required a whole further population of people who never lifted a block. The farmers who grew the grain, the herders who raised the cattle, the potters who made the thousands of bread molds and beer jars, the miners who dug the copper, the boatmen who moved it all along the river. In a real sense, a large part of the entire kingdom was involved in building the pyramid, most of them never setting foot on the site, each contributing their small piece from wherever they were. The pyramid was a national undertaking in the fullest sense, a thing that an entire society made together, and the tens of thousands at the site were only the visible tip of a far larger effort that reached into nearly every village in the land. Now let us talk about who these workers actually were, because they were not one single kind of person, and the arrangement was cleverer and kinder than a simple army of laborers. There seem to have been two broad groups. First, a core of permanent workers, skilled craftsmen who lived at the site more or less year-round, the expert stonemasons who knew how to cut and dress the blocks, the engineers and overseers who understood the ramps and the leveling and the alignment, the toolmakers, the scribes, the artisans. These were professionals, the equivalent of a permanent skilled staff, and they were housed and paid and stayed for the long haul, building their careers on the great project. These were people at the top of their craft, and their skill was hard-won and precious. A master mason who could dress a block of hard granite until its face was true and smooth, working with copper and stone and endless patience, was as valuable in his way as any expert today. It took years to learn such a trade, years of apprenticeship, watching and copying and slowly gaining the feel of the stone. And that knowledge was passed down from the experienced to the young, generation by generation, so that the skills needed to build a pyramid were held and handed on within families and workshops. A living tradition of expertise. Some of these skilled workers would have spent their entire lives on the great royal building projects, moving perhaps from one to the next, as kings came and went, and new monuments were begun. They were career builders, proud specialists, the keepers of the knowledge that made the whole thing possible. Without them, without their accumulated skill and their carefully guarded techniques, the willing hands of the seasonal farmers would have had no one to guide them. The permanent craftsmen were the mind and memory of the enterprise, and the seasonal workers were its muscle, and together, expertise and effort, they raised the pyramid. And then, around that skilled core, a much larger group came and went. These were ordinary people, farmers for the most part, who came to work on the pyramid for a stretch of time and then went home. And the timing of when they came is one of the most beautiful pieces of the whole story, because it fits so perfectly with the rhythm of the land. Egypt lived and died by the river. Every year, the great river flooded, rising and spreading across the fields, and while the flood was on the land, there was no farming to be done. The fields were under water. The farmers, for those weeks and months, had no work in their fields at all, and it was precisely then, during the flood season, that they came to build the pyramid. The whole of Egyptian life turned on this yearly flood. When the waters rose, they spread rich, dark soil across the fields, And that gift of fertile mud was what made the land so bountiful, what fed the whole civilization. But while the flood was actually on the land, farming simply stopped. You cannot plow a field that is underwater. So there was a long stretch of every year, built into the rhythm of the seasons, when a vast number of able-bodied people had nothing to do in the fields and were, in a sense, available. A society that could organize itself could turn that idle season into the greatest building force the ancient world had ever seen. Think about how neatly that works. The flood that stopped the farming also raised the river high enough to float the heavy stones close to the building site. So the very season that freed the farmer's hands was the season that made the building easiest. The pyramid was built in large part during the months each year when the land itself rested under water and its people were free to turn to something else. It was woven into the cycle of the seasons, a great shared task for the time of year when the fields could not be worked. And this changes the whole feeling of it. This was not a permanent population of the enslaved, chained to the stone for life. It was, in large part, a rotating national workforce, ordinary people coming to do a season's labor on the greatest project in the kingdom, and then returning to their farms when the waters fell and the fields reappeared. It was closer to a vast public work, a thing the whole society took part in, than to a prison of forced labor. We should be careful and honest here, because the arrangement was not quite the same as a modern job that people freely choose and can freely leave. There was almost certainly an element of obligation to it, a duty owed to the king and the state, a kind of labor that people were expected to give as their share. In that sense, it was not entirely voluntary in the way we would understand the word. But that is a very different thing from slavery. It was more like a duty of service that fell on people as part of belonging to the society, a contribution expected of them, in exchange for which they were fed and housed and cared for and honored. Many societies through history have had such systems of shared labor owed to the community or the crown. It is not the same as being owned, worked, and discarded, and there is good reason to think that for many it was a source of pride rather than resentment. To work on the king's pyramid was to take part in something sacred and magnificent, something that mattered to the whole kingdom and to the gods. The king was not merely a ruler but a divine figure, and his monument was a holy work, a thing meant to secure the well-being of the entire land through his safe passage into the next world. To contribute your strength to that was to be part of something far larger than yourself. The cheerful gang names, the proud tomb inscriptions, the little imitation pyramids of the workers' own graves, all of these speak of people who felt honored to have been part of it, not people who felt only the lash. Rest a moment on that, because it is a gentler and truer picture than the old one. The pyramid built not by the broken, but by the willing, by skilled craftsmen proud of their trade, and by ordinary farmers giving a season of their strength, fed on bread and beer and beef, housed in a real town, part of something enormous that their whole world was making together. Now let us come to the most human thing of all, the thing that reaches across 4,500 years and almost lets us hear their voices, because these workers left us their names and their humor and their pride. They organized themselves into teams, into work gangs, and each gang had a name. And we know these names because the workers painted them onto the blocks of stone in the hidden spaces of the pyramid, in places that were never meant to be seen, sealed away inside the structure forever. And when we finally found them, in those dark hidden chambers, we found the workers had signed their work. The place these names survive is itself remarkable. High inside the Great Pyramid, above the king's burial chamber, there are a series of narrow spaces, hollow gaps left in the stonework, to help relieve the tremendous weight of the pyramid pressing down on the chamber below. These spaces were sealed when the pyramid was built and were never meant for any human eye. They were structural, hidden, buried in the heart of the mountain. And it was there, when explorers finally forced their way into those cramped, dark gaps thousands of years later, that they found the painted marks, the gang names and notations daubed onto the stones by the workers as they set them. Think about what that means. The workers wrote their names in a place they knew would be sealed forever, that no one would ever see, that served no purpose but to be closed up in darkness inside the stone. They did not do it to be seen. They did it, perhaps, simply to mark that they had been there, that this stone was theirs, that their gang had set it. It is the purest kind of pride, the kind that needs no audience. A worker, high in the rising pyramid, painting his team's name onto a block that was about to be sealed into eternal darkness, just so that it would be true forever that they had done this. And the names they chose are wonderful. They are not grim, they are proud and warm and sometimes funny. One gang called themselves the Friends of Khufu, taking the name of their king. Another, working on a later pyramid, called themselves the Drunkards of Menkaura, which is not the sort of name that frightened, beaten slaves paint on a wall for a joke. These are the names of teams with spirit, teams that had an identity, teams that competed with each other and took pride in their work, the way a crew or a team anywhere does. And the way the workforce was structured is fascinating in itself because it was organized rather like a fleet of ships. The largest units were called by a word that also meant a crew of a boat, and these were divided into smaller groups, and those into smaller ones still, right down to teams of a handful of men. Each level had its name and its leader. It was a clear, sensible hierarchy, the kind of structure that lets you take tens of thousands of people and break them down into manageable groups, each with someone responsible for it, so that orders and effort could flow up and down the whole vast organization without descending into chaos. There is something familiar and human in that too. We organize ourselves the same way today, in companies and teams and departments, in units within units. The pyramid builders had worked out 4,500 years ago that the way to accomplish something enormous is to divide it among many small groups, each with its own identity and its own leader and its own pride, and then to knit those groups together into a greater whole. The cheerful gang names are the visible sign of that. Each little team was a community with a name to belong to, competing perhaps with the gang working the next section, all of them pulling in the end toward the same rising peak. Rest a moment on that, and let it be as lovely as it is. Deep inside the Great Pyramid, in spaces sealed in darkness for 4,500 years, there are the names of the men who built it, painted by their own hands, proud names, cheerful names, the names of gangs who wanted, in some small way, to say we were here, we did this. This stone is ours. It is one of the most human things in all of ancient Egypt. Not a king's boast carved for all to see, but ordinary workers' names, hidden in the dark, meant for no audience at all except perhaps themselves and their god. And they left more than names. Near the workers' town, archaeologists found the workers' cemetery, the graves of the people who built the pyramids, and what those graves contain tells us once again that these were not slaves. The very location of that cemetery says something. It sits close to the pyramids themselves, in the shadow of the great monuments, on the sacred plateau. To be buried there near the king's own eternal home was a place of honor. Slaves would not be laid to rest in such a place. The workers were given ground near the very thing they had built, as though to say that they belonged there, that their part in the great work had earned them a place beside it forever. There is something deeply fitting in that. The people who raised the mountain were allowed to rest in its shadow, permanently, part of the sacred landscape they had helped to create, because the workers were buried properly, with care, with dignity. They were given tombs of their own, modest ones, of course, nothing like the king's, but real tombs, with their bodies carefully placed, and with goods to accompany them into the afterlife. Bread and beer set out for their journey, just as the Egyptians did for anyone they honored. Some of the tombs even have little inscriptions naming the person and giving their title, the job they did on the great project. And those titles are a quiet treasure because they let us see the many different roles that made up the workforce. There were overseers of the various teams. There was a director of the workers, an inspector of building, a fellow described as being in charge of a work gang. There were craftsmen of many kinds. The titles show a whole ranked society of labor, with responsibilities and positions and honors. People who had risen to lead others, people proud enough of their role to have it carved on their tomb for eternity. A man who was an overseer of the pyramid workers wanted that written on his grave, wanted to be remembered forever as one who had helped build the great thing and to hold a place of responsibility in the doing of it. Some of these workers' tombs even imitate, in miniature and in mud brick rather than fine stone, the shape of the great monuments they helped to raise, little pyramids of their own, as though the builders wanted to carry something of the grandeur of their work into their own resting places. There is real dignity in that and real pride. These were people who knew they had been part of something magnificent and who wanted to be remembered as such, and who were given the means to be in death near the very monument their hands had raised. You do not do this for slaves. You do not build tombs for people you have worked to death and provide them with offerings for eternity. The workers were buried near the pyramid they built, honored in death, given their names and their titles and their place in the next world. The care taken over their graves is the care taken over people who were valued, who belonged, who were part of the great and sacred work. And those graves tell us something else, something more tender and more sobering, because the bones of the workers carry the marks of their lives. When their skeletons are studied, you can read in them the story of the labor. Their spines and joints often show the wear of many years of heavy lifting and hard physical work. Some bones show injuries, broken and then healed, the fractures you would expect from accidents on a great construction site, a falling stone, a slip on a ramp. But here is the thing that moves me most. Many of those injuries had healed. The broken bones had been set and mended, and the person had lived on and gone back to work, which means someone cared for them. There was medical care on the site, such as it was in that age. When a worker was hurt, they were not simply discarded. Their bones were set, and they were allowed to heal, and they returned to their lives. Some of the skeletons show broken arms and legs that were set so well that they healed almost straight, which takes real skill, the work of someone who knew how to splint and bind a fracture and tend it while it mended. There are even signs of more dramatic care. Some workers show evidence of the amputation of a badly injured limb, and then survived the operation and lived on for years afterward, which in that age, without any of what we would call medicine, meant careful treatment and a long recovery, watched over by someone. There are skulls that show signs of surgery, holes cut into the bone in a way that the person survived, the edges healed over. These are not the remains of people who were used up and thrown away. They are the remains of people who, when they were badly hurt, were treated and kept alive and given the chance to recover, at real cost and effort to those around them. That is not the treatment of the disposable. That is the treatment of people whose lives were held to be worth saving. And it tells us something about the values of the whole enterprise. Someone decided that an injured worker was worth a doctor's time, worth the effort of setting a bone or tending a wound through the weeks of healing. The workforce was cared for, not merely used, and the proof of it is written in bones that broke and were mended and healed 4,500 years ago. Rest a moment on that, gently. A worker on the Great Pyramid, 4,500 years ago, breaks a leg in an accident on the ramps, and instead of being left to die, the leg is set and splinted and given time and heals, and the worker walks again and lives and works, and is buried at last with honor near the great stone mountain they helped to raise. That is the reality the bones reveal, and it is a world away from the old story of the whip and the chain. Now let us bring back the one voice from all of this that speaks to us most directly, because among all the traces the builders left, there is one that is almost a letter to us across the ages. A few years ago, archaeologists found, in a cave by the Red Sea, a collection of papyrus documents, the oldest inscribed papyrus ever discovered, and they turned out to be the working records of a team involved in building the Great Pyramid. In particular, they contain the logbook of a man, an official, a team leader whose name we can read, and in that logbook, he records the daily work of his crew. Think about what that means. This is not a king's grand inscription boasting of his monuments. This is a working man's diary, an ordinary record of ordinary days, kept by a foreman doing his job. And it survived. For 4,500 years, this humble logbook lay in a cave, and now we can read it. And through it we can look directly over the shoulder of a man who helped to build the Great Pyramid. He records how his team transported limestone by boat from a quarry across the river to the pyramid site, journey after journey. He notes the days and the deliveries and the comings and goings. He records his crew being given their rations. He notes trips to collect supplies. He even mentions stopping at the royal residence and being issued food and provisions. It is administrative and matter-of-fact and utterly ordinary, and that is exactly what makes it so precious. Because through its ordinariness, a real person comes into view. A competent, organized official keeping careful track of his crew's work, proud enough of it to record it neatly, going about the business of helping to raise a wonder of the world as though it were simply his job, which of course to him it was. And notice what the diary does not contain. There is no mention of cruelty, no hint of forced labor, no suggestion of anything but organized work, properly supplied and provisioned. The men in his crew are given their food. They travel, they load, they haul, they deliver, they rest, they are fed. It reads like the record of any well-run operation, because that is what it was. If the pyramids had truly been built by driven, starving slaves, this diary, the actual working record of an actual crew, is where you would expect to catch some shadow of it. Instead, you find rations and boats, and the steady rhythm of provisioned labor. The diary also gives us a sense of the sheer complexity of what was being coordinated. His crew did not only haul stone, they moved between sites, collected materials, dealt with officials, drew supplies from central stores. A single team's work touched quarries, boats, the river, the building site, and the administration that fed and directed them. Multiply that by all the teams working at once, and you begin to sense the size of the organization holding it all together. The countless small logbooks like his that must once have existed, tracking the countless crews, all feeding into the great effort. His is the one that happened to survive, our single surviving thread from an enormous web of careful record-keeping that once wrapped the entire project. Rest a moment on that man. He did not know he was building something that would still stand, still astonish, 45 centuries later. He did not know his little logbook would outlast his entire civilization and be read by people in a future he could not imagine. He was just doing his work, keeping his records, leading his team, hauling the stone. And through his plain and careful notes, he reaches us and we can almost hear him, an ordinary person at the heart of an extraordinary thing. And that, in the end, is who built the pyramids. Not gods, not aliens, not the broken and the enslaved. Ordinary people. Skilled craftsmen who took pride in their trade, farmers who gave a season of their labor, foremen who kept careful records, bakers who fed the workforce, and doctors who set their broken bones, and the men of the work gangs who painted their cheerful names in the hidden dark. A whole society, organized and willing, gathered around a great shared task, and giving it their strength, and their skill, and their years, and more people than we can ever count or name. For every worker whose bones we have found, whose gang name we have read, whose title we can recite, there were thousands whose traces are gone. The woman who ground the grain and baked the bread that fed a hauling crew, whose name we will never know. The child who carried water to the workers on the ramps. The old craftsman who taught the young masons how to read the grain of the stone. The boatmen who brought the granite down the river. The herders in distant villages who raised the cattle. Layer upon layer of ordinary lives, most of them leaving no mark at all of them part of the great work, all of them gone now into the deep silence of the past. The Great Pyramid is, in a sense, a monument to all of them, to the countless anonymous people whose small labors made it possible. We remember the king whose name is on it. But the pyramid was really made by the many, by an entire people, most of whom are utterly forgotten, and whose only memorial is the mountain of stone itself, still standing, still astonishing, the sum of all their vanished effort. There is something in that which I find more moving than any tale of god, kings, and magic. The pyramid is not a monument to cruelty, it is a monument to cooperation, to what ordinary people can do when they gather their effort together and point it at a single goal and hold to it year after year, generation after generation. It says, across 4,500 years, that human beings working together, fed and organized and cared for, can raise a mountain to the sky. And it left us, tucked into its hidden corners and buried in the sand at its feet, the names, the meals, the bones, and even the diary of the people who did it. And I think there is a reason the true story took so long to emerge, and it is worth a gentle thought. For a long time, people found it easier to believe in suffering than in cooperation. It seemed obvious that such a monstrous amount of work could only have been wrung out of people by force. The idea that tens of thousands might have labored willingly, proudly, well-fed and cared for, toward a shared goal seemed almost too good to be true. And yet that is what the evidence shows. Perhaps the deepest lesson of the workers' town and the workers' graves is simply that human beings are capable of extraordinary things when they come together freely around a common purpose. And that we should not always assume the worst about what lies behind great achievements. Sometimes the truth is kinder than the legend. Sometimes a wonder of the world turns out to have been built not by the whip, but by people who wanted to build it. So let us come back now gently from the crowded, dusty, living world of the builders and let the whole thing settle into quiet. They are all gone now, of course, every one of them. The proud gangs with their cheerful names, the farmers who came in the flood season and went home when the waters fell, the foreman with his careful logbook, the bakers and the brewers, and the doctors who set the broken bones, the skilled masons who dressed the shining white stone. They lived their lives and did their work, and were buried near the great thing they had made, and the sand closed over their town, and 4,500 years went by. But we found them again, their town, their bakeries, their bones, their names, their diary. After all those centuries of imagining faceless slaves, we lifted the sand and found real people instead, people we could name and know and honor, people who ate well and worked hard and looked after each other and took pride in what they built. The old story of suffering gave way at last to a truer and kinder one. And there is something restful in that, I think, at the end of a long day, that the truth, when we finally reached it, turned out to be gentler than the legend, that the greatest monument of the ancient world was raised not by the broken, but by the willing, not by the whip, but by the shared effort of ordinary people who were fed and housed and cared for and remembered. It is good to know that. It is good to be able to picture them not as suffering shadows, but as living people, tired at the end of a long day's work, sharing bread and beer, calling out the name of their gang, resting. They rested at the end of their days, just as you are resting now. The same tiredness in the body after work, the same relief of setting down the load, the same night coming on, and the same stars wheeling over the desert, the very stars they used to square their great pyramid to the heavens. That is perhaps the loveliest thread to hold as you drift, that across 4,500 years, so much of their experience was the same as yours. They grew tired. They ate and drank together at the end of the day, and no doubt talked and laughed and complained about the work, as people do. They took pride in doing a thing well. They belonged to a team and cared about it and gave it a name. They looked after each other when someone was hurt. They wanted to be remembered. When they were tired, they rested, and when night came, they slept, under those same wheeling stars. The distance between us and them is vast in years, but small in all the things that matter. They were not strange alien beings from an unimaginable past. They were people, exactly like you, who happened to live very long ago and who happened to build something that has lasted. If you could sit with one of them at the end of a working day, I think you would find them entirely familiar, entirely human, and rather good company. They knew things you would recognize, tiredness and pride and belonging, and the sweetness of rest at the end of a hard day. So let your breathing slow, and let the dusty, crowded work site grow quiet, and let the workers set down their tools and their ropes and go home through the evening to their town, to their bread and their beer and their rest, 4,500 years ago, under the same sky that is over you now. There is nothing here you need to carry. Their work is long finished. The stones are all placed. The people who placed them did their part and were honored for it, and have been at rest for a very long time. And the mountain they made still stands, holding their names in its hidden heart, keeping its silent watch over the desert where they sleep. Sleep now, as they sleep, and let the builders of the Great Pyramid rest on in the honor they earned, their work complete, their names remembered at last, their long day over under the quiet turning stars until the morning comes. Deep inside the Great Pyramid, in the dark at the heart of all that stone, there are passages and chambers that have puzzled people for thousands of years. And just a few years ago, using a technology that would have seemed like magic to anyone before our own age, Scientists discovered something new in there, a great empty space hidden in the solid rock that no human eye has seen and no one can yet explain. The Great Pyramid is not a solid mountain of stone, as you might imagine. It has rooms inside it and corridors and shafts, and at least one enormous soaring gallery, all buried in the heart of the structure. And the strange thing, the thing that has kept people wondering for so long, is that we still do not fully understand why they are arranged the way they are, or whether there is more still to find. Tonight we are going to go inside, down the passages, through the chambers, up the great gallery into the hidden spaces, and finally to that mysterious void discovered in our own time. And I promise to leave you not with fear or unease, but with the gentle wonder of a very old building that still holds a secret or two, waiting patiently in the dark. But before we go a step further, let me ask you something, softly, because it matters more than you might think. If these quiet journeys through the great stories of the past help you set down the weight of your day and find your way toward rest, then please, take just a moment right now before you settle any deeper into the warm and subscribe. It is one small tap, but it means the next of these will find its way back to you on some future restless night when sleep is a long way off and you need somewhere gentle to put your mind. And it helps, more than you could possibly know, to keep these stories being made, for you and for everybody else out there in the dark tonight, looking for a little peace. So if you would, subscribe and stay with me, night after night, as we wander together through the great slow stories of how our world came to be. And tell me, if you will, from wherever you happen to be resting tonight, in whatever quiet corner of the world is holding you, where are you listening from? And what hour has it reached where you are? Leave it in the comments below. It is a lovely thing to see all the places and all the hours gathered there together, all of us drifting off beneath the same turning sky, in 100 different countries and 100 different hours, all of us here in the dark at once. And now, let your shoulders come down, and let your breathing slow, and let the whole weight of your day loosen and fall away. Come with me back across 4,500 years to a doorway on the north face of a great stone mountain, and let us step, quietly, inside. Something else worth pausing on before we go in. Most great buildings give up their secrets easily. You can walk through a cathedral or a palace and see, more or less, everything there is to see. The rooms are open, the purpose is plain. But the Great Pyramid is different. Most of it is truly solid, millions of tons of packed stone, and the hollow spaces within it are few and hidden and reached by cramped, sealed passages, and their purposes are debated to this day. It is a building that hides itself, that keeps most of its interior locked away in the dark, that reveals only a little and holds the rest back. And that is exactly why it has fascinated people for so many centuries, and why even now it can still surprise us. For most of history, everything we knew about the inside came from the few passages and chambers that people had managed to enter. Beyond those, the vast bulk of the pyramid was simply unreachable, unknowable, and there was always the tantalizing question that would not go away. In all that solid stone, might there be more? More chambers, more hidden spaces, sealed away with no door, waiting in the dark? For thousands of years there was no way to answer. And then, in our own time, there was. Let us begin with what a pyramid was actually for, because it helps to understand what we are walking into. The Great Pyramid was a tomb for a king, the one we call Khufu, who ruled Egypt around 4,500 years ago. But it was not a tomb in the simple sense of a place to put a body. To the Egyptians it was something far grander. It was a machine for eternity, a vast engine of stone designed to carry the king safely out of this life and into the next, and to secure his existence among the gods forever. The Egyptians believed deeply and elaborately in a life after death, and they believed that a king, above all, needed to make the passage from this world to the next successfully, because the well-being of the whole kingdom depended on it. So the pyramid was built to protect his body, to house the goods he would need, and, in ways we still do not fully grasp, to help his spirit rise and join the eternal order of the heavens. Everything inside it, every chamber and passage and shaft, was part of that sacred purpose. So as we go inside, remember that we are not walking through a building in the ordinary sense. We are walking through a sacred machine. built with enormous care and at enormous cost to do the most important thing the Egyptians could imagine, which was to defeat death itself, at least for a king. The very shape of the pyramid was part of that purpose. To the Egyptians, the pointed form reaching to the sky may have represented the rays of the sun slanting down to earth, a great stone ramp of sunlight by which the king could climb to join the sun god in the heavens. Or it may have echoed a sacred mound from their stories of creation, the first dry land that rose from the waters at the beginning of the world. The pyramid pointed upward, toward the sky, toward the sun and the eternal stars, because that was where the king was going. It was not just a container for a body, it was a launching point for a soul aimed at the heavens, and the location mattered too. The pyramids sit on the west bank of the great river, and to the Egyptians the west, where the sun set each evening, was the land of the dead. The direction the sun traveled when it left the world of the living each night to journey through the underworld. So the king was laid to rest in the land of the setting sun, on the western shore, facing the eternal cycle of death and rebirth that they saw played out in the sky every single day. Everything about the pyramid, its shape, its place, its alignment, its hidden chambers, was woven into a vast and careful vision of death and the sky and eternal life. Now let us step through the entrance. The original entrance is on the north face, some way up from the ground, a modest opening that gives no hint of the scale of what lies within. And from that entrance, a passage leads downward, sloping steeply into the bedrock beneath the pyramid. This descending passage is long and narrow and low, so that you would have to stoop or even crawl to make your way down it, deep into the rock below the whole enormous weight of the stone above. And it leads to a strange place. Far underground, cut into the bedrock itself, there is a chamber, an unfinished chamber. Its floor is rough and uneven, left as though the work simply stopped partway through. For a long time, this underground room has puzzled people because it seems abandoned, incomplete, as if the original plan was changed while the pyramid was being built. To reach it, in the old days, meant a long descent into the dark, down that steep, low, narrow passage. Bent double, the weight of the entire pyramid pressing down through the rock above your head, deeper and deeper below the ground, until you came out into this rough hollow in the bedrock. It is a strange and slightly eerie place, unfinished and silent, far below the great chambers where the real focus of the pyramid lies. There is even a deep pit dug into its floor, and a small passage that runs a little way into the rock and then simply stops, going nowhere, as though someone began to extend it and then abandoned the effort. Everything about the underground chamber speaks of work halted, of a plan set aside. And that may be exactly what happened. The leading idea is that the builders changed their minds more than once as the pyramid rose, that the plan for where the king would finally be laid to rest was altered during construction, perhaps twice, so that earlier chambers were begun and then abandoned in favor of new ones higher up. The unfinished chamber deep in the rock may be the first plan, started and then left behind, when they decided to place the king's chamber higher within the body of the pyramid itself. There is even a second abandoned chamber to support this idea. Partway up, reached by a horizontal passage branching off the ascending corridor, there is another room, often called the Queen's Chamber, though that name is misleading and was given long after by people who assumed wrongly that a queen was buried there. It never held a queen. It too appears to be a chamber that was begun and then left, perhaps intended at one stage to be the king's own resting place, before the plan changed once more and the final chamber was built higher still. So there are, in a sense, three possible burial chambers inside the Great Pyramid at three different levels, one deep in the rock, one in the middle, and one high up, as though we can read three successive versions of the plan, stacked one above another, frozen in the stone. Why did they keep changing the plan? We do not know for certain. Perhaps the king's ambitions grew as the pyramid rose and his reign lengthened. Perhaps there were structural worries, or religious reasons, or simply a shifting sense of what the great monument ought to be. But the effect is that the inside of the Great Pyramid preserves a kind of record of its own making, a history of decisions and revisions written into its very structure. It is not a single frozen idea. It is a process caught in stone. Rest a moment on that, because it is a very human thing to find at the heart of such a perfect-looking monument. A change of mind. A plan begun and then abandoned. The Great Pyramid, which looks from outside like the product of a single flawless vision, seems on the inside to record second thoughts, revisions, decisions made, and then unmade, halfway through the greatest building project in the world. It makes the builders feel closer somehow. They were working it out as they went, just as anyone would. Now let us come back up and take the other path, because partway down the descending passage, another passage branches off and climbs upward into the body of the pyramid. This ascending passage rises through the stone at the same steep angle, low and narrow like the first, climbing up into the heart of the structure. And it was sealed. After the king was laid to rest, this passage was plugged with great blocks of granite, slid down to block the way, to protect what lay above from robbers. For a long time, those granite plugs kept the upper chambers hidden and sealed. When people finally forced their way in, much later, they had to tunnel around the granite blocks because the plugs were far too hard to break through, and you can still go through that forced passage today around the ancient seals. And yet, for all that careful sealing, the pyramid was robbed. Somehow, at some point in the long centuries after it was built, robbers found their way in, passed or around the seals, and reached the king's chamber and took whatever was there. When the first recorded explorers entered in later ages, they found the upper chambers already empty, already plundered, the great stone box open and bare. All that effort, all that granite, all that sealing and hiding and protecting, and still in the end, the tomb was breached and emptied. It is one of the sad ironies of the pyramids and of Egyptian tombs in general. The Egyptians poured enormous effort into protecting their dead and the treasures buried with them, sealing them behind plugs and false passages and tons of stone. And almost every tomb was robbed anyway, often within a few generations, sometimes by the very workers who had helped to build it and knew its secrets. The wealth buried with the kings was simply too great a temptation. The Great Pyramid, the most heavily built and heavily sealed of them all, was no exception. Whatever riches were placed in that granite chamber vanished long ago into hands we will never know. And when you climb up the ascending passage, it opens, suddenly and wonderfully, into one of the most remarkable spaces ever built by human hands, the Grand Gallery. After all those cramped, low, narrow passages where you have to stoop and crawl, the Grand Gallery soars. It is a long, steep, high corridor climbing upward through the pyramid, and its ceiling rises high above you, far higher than seems possible in such a place, higher than a house, a great vault of stone opening up suddenly in the heart of the mountain. The walls are built of great blocks of polished limestone, and as they rise, they step inward, each course jutting slightly further in than the one below, so that the walls seem to lean in over you as they climb toward a narrow ceiling far overhead. It is a masterpiece of stonework, precise and beautiful and strange, and it climbs up through the darkness for a great distance toward the king's chamber above. Imagine the experience of it, coming up from below. You have crawled up the low ascending passage, bent double in the dark, the stone close on every side pressing in, and then all at once the ceiling vanishes upward into blackness and the space opens out, and you can stand and stretch and look up into a soaring vault you cannot even see the top of. After the tight, crushing passages, the sudden vastness of the Grand Gallery must have felt like a kind of release, like stepping out of a tunnel into a great hall. It is a deliberate piece of drama, built into the structure, a sudden opening up at the heart of the climb, and it still works its effect on everyone who experiences it, 4,500 years later. Nobody is entirely sure why the Grand Gallery is so tall and so grand. It may have served a practical purpose during construction, as a space where the great granite plugs were stored before being slid down to seal the passages. It may have had a sacred meaning, a soaring space for the king's spirit to ascend. It may be both, but whatever its purpose, to stand in it, even today, is to feel a kind of awe. This enormous, precise, soaring space, hidden in the heart of a mountain of stone, built 4,500 years ago, with a beauty that seems to go far beyond mere function. The precision of it is what stops you. The great blocks of the walls are fitted so closely that the joints are barely visible. The corbelled ceiling, where each course steps inward over the one below, rises in perfect steps toward the narrow top, and it has held its shape, without sagging or shifting, for 45 centuries, bearing the weight of the pyramid pressing in on it from every side. Along the base of each wall runs a smooth ramp of stone, and set into these are curious regularly spaced slots or niches, whose purpose is still debated. Some think they held beams or supports used during construction. Some think they anchored the mechanism that lowered the granite plugs. Like so much in the pyramid, they are precise, deliberate, clearly meaningful, and not fully understood. To walk up the Grand Gallery is to climb a long, steep, high, dark ascent, with those great walls leaning in overhead, the stone cool and close around you, the ceiling lost in shadow far above. It must have been an extraordinary thing for the ancient priests who climbed it, carrying the king toward his final chamber, their torches throwing light up those soaring stepped walls. And it is an extraordinary thing still, this hidden gallery, this secret cathedral of stone, buried in the dark heart of the pyramid, built with a care and a grandeur that no one on the outside would ever see. Rest a moment there in the Grand Gallery, in the dark, with those great stepped walls climbing up and away above you into the black. It is one of the most extraordinary interior spaces in the world, and almost nobody pictures it when they think of the pyramids. They picture the outside, the great triangular mountain. But inside, hidden away, there is this soaring cathedral of stone, and it has been there silent in the dark for 45 centuries. At the top of the Grand Gallery, the passage narrows again, and you pass through a low doorway into the heart of the whole structure, the King's Chamber. It is a room of red granite, brought as we know all the way from the quarries hundreds of kilometers to the south. The walls are made of enormous granite blocks, fitted together with great precision. The ceiling is formed of gigantic granite beams, each weighing as much as many dozens of large cars, spanning the width of the room high overhead. And it is a plain room, austere, without decoration, without inscriptions, without paintings, just the bare, magnificent, precise granite, and at one end a single object, a great empty box of granite carved from one solid piece which once held, or was meant to hold, the body of the king. The austerity of it is striking and a little haunting. Most Egyptian tombs are covered, wall to wall, in paintings and carvings and inscriptions, rich with images of gods and spells to guide the dead through the afterlife, bright with color. But the king's chamber at the heart of the greatest pyramid is bare. Plain red granite, beautifully worked, and nothing else. No word, no image, no decoration of any kind. Why the grandest tomb of all should be the plainest inside is another of the pyramid's quiet puzzles. Perhaps the sheer perfection of the stonework was meant to be enough. Perhaps the decoration was to be added and never was. Perhaps the plainness itself held a meaning we have lost. We simply do not know. And the sarcophagus itself holds a small mystery of its own. It is slightly too large to have been brought up through the passages that lead to the chamber, which means it must have been placed there while the pyramid was still being built, set in position, and then walled around, sealed into the growing structure as the stone rose about it. The king's stone coffin was, in a sense, built into the pyramid from the beginning, enclosed at the very heart of the mountain as it grew up around it. The sarcophagus. It sits there still, empty, lidless in the silent granite room at the heart of the pyramid. Whatever it once contained is long gone, taken away in some ancient robbery, or moved or lost to time. When the first explorers reached this chamber long ago, they found it empty, the great stone box open and bare, the king vanished. And it has been empty ever since, this plain granite coffer in the plain granite room, deep inside the mountain. Rest a moment on that emptiness, because there is something powerful in it. All of this, 2.5 million blocks, 20 years of labor, tens of thousands of workers, the quarrying and the hauling and the raising and the sealing, all of it, in the end, was built around this one small room and this one stone box, meant to hold and protect one man on his journey into eternity. And the box is empty. Whatever was placed there is gone. The greatest tomb ever built did not, in the end, keep what it was made to keep. And yet there is another way to see it, and it is gentler. The king wanted, above all else, to be remembered, to endure, to not be forgotten by time. And in that, he succeeded beyond anything he could have dreamed. His body may be gone, his treasures scattered, his stone box empty. But his name is known to the entire world, 4,500 years later. His pyramid still stands, the most famous building on Earth, visited and wondered at by people from every corner of the globe. In the deepest sense, the pyramid worked. It did not preserve his body, but it preserved his memory and his name, and it carried them across 4,500 years to us tonight. That is a kind of eternal life of a sort, and perhaps the only kind any of us really gets, to be remembered. And no one has ever been remembered longer, or by more people, than the king in the empty box at the heart of the Great Pyramid. Now, above the king's chamber, there is something clever and hidden, and it brings us toward the mysteries. Above the granite ceiling of the king's chamber, the builders left a series of empty spaces, one above another, 5 in all, separated by more great granite beams. These are the relieving chambers, and they were never meant to be entered or seen. Their purpose was structural. The weight of the pyramid pressing down above the king's chamber is immense, and without some way to manage it, that weight might have cracked the ceiling and collapsed the room. So the builders left these hollow spaces above the chamber to relieve and redirect the tremendous load, channeling it out and around the room below so that the king's chamber would stand, protected for eternity. And it worked. 4,500 years of the pyramid's weight has pressed down, and the king's chamber still stands, its ceiling intact, held up by the cleverness of those hidden hollow spaces. It is a piece of engineering so sound that it has held for 45 centuries, an understanding of weight and stress and structure that we did not expect from builders so long ago, worked out and built into the hidden heart of the pyramid where no one would ever see it. And the very top of this arrangement shows how well they understood the problem. Above the highest of the hollow relieving chambers, the builders placed great granite beams leaning against each other to form a pointed peaked roof, like the two sides of a tent meeting at the top. This shape, an inverted V of massive stone, is beautifully designed to take the enormous weight bearing down from the pyramid above and split it, directing it down and out to either side, away from the chamber below, rather than letting it press straight down onto the flat ceiling. It is the same principle that holds up an arch or the peaked roof of a house, understood and applied in stone weighing many tons 4,500 years ago. To find such sophisticated structural thinking hidden away above a chamber, in spaces no one was ever meant to enter, tells you something about the builders. They were not simply piling up stone and hoping. They understood deeply how weight moves through a structure, how to protect a space from the crushing load above it, how to build something that would not merely stand for a while but stand for the ages. And they did this work carefully and well, even in the parts no eye would ever see, because it had to be right, because the king's eternal rest depended on it, and because that, perhaps, was simply how they built. And it was in those hidden relieving chambers, as we heard, that the workers left their painted gang names daubed on the stones in spaces sealed forever in darkness. So those hidden structural spaces gave us, by chance, one of our most human glimpses of the builders. But they also deepen a mystery, because the more we look inside the pyramid, the more we realize how much of it was never meant to be seen, and the more we wonder what else might be hidden in the stone. There are also the shafts, and they are strange and wonderful. From both the king's chamber and another chamber below it, narrow shafts run outward and upward through the body of the pyramid. They are far too small for a person to pass through, only about the width of your hand. For a long time, nobody knew what they were for. Some point toward the sky in directions that line up with particular stars, and it has been suggested that they were meant as channels for the king's spirit to travel up toward the heavens, toward the eternal stars around which the sky turns. Others may have been for ventilation, to bring air into the chambers. Perhaps they were both practical and sacred at once, as so much in the pyramid seems to be. The idea of the star shafts is a beautiful one, and it fits the Egyptian vision of death so well. The Egyptians believed that the king, after death, would rise to join the imperishable stars, the ones that circle the northern sky and never set, never sink below the horizon, and so seem to them eternal, undying. A shaft aimed at that part of the sky might be a road for the soul, a straight channel cut through the mountain of stone, pointing the way to the eternal stars, so that the king's spirit could rise directly from his chamber and travel up the shaft and out into the heavens, to take his place among the undying lights forever. Whether or not that is truly what they were for, there is something moving in the thought that the builders might have cut these narrow channels through millions of tons of stone, aimed with care at particular stars, not for any practical reason, but to give a soul a path to the sky. It is the kind of thing that reminds us how differently the Egyptians saw the world, how thoroughly their architecture was bound up with the heavens and the afterlife, how the whole pyramid was, in a sense, an instrument pointed at eternity. And these shafts hold their own small mysteries. Deep inside one of them, robotic cameras sent up the narrow channels because no human could fit, found something unexpected. A small stone door, or block, with what appear to be copper handles or pins set into it, blocking the shaft partway along its length. A tiny door, deep in the stone, that no one knew was there, sealing off the far end of a shaft too narrow for a person to reach. What lies beyond it, if anything, we still do not know. It is one of the small sealed secrets of the pyramid, a little door in the dark, waiting. The exploration of these shafts is a wonderful story in itself. They are only about 20 centimeters across, far too small for any person. So over the years, a series of small specially built robots were sent creeping up them, trailing cables, carrying tiny cameras and lights, inching their way through the narrow stone channels into the dark. And it was one of these little machines that found the first stone door with its two small copper pins. Later, another robot managed to drill a tiny hole through that door and push a camera through to look at the space beyond. And what it found was a small hidden chamber, and on its floor, more mysteries, and another stone door behind the first. Nobody knows what these tiny sealed doors were for. Were they symbolic? Doors for the king's spirit to pass through on its journey to the stars? Doors not meant for any body but for a soul? Were they meant to seal something away? Were they simply markers of some kind whose meaning is lost? The copper pins are beautifully made, deliberate, clearly important to whoever placed them there. And they sit, deep in a shaft no wider than a dinner plate. In the heart of the pyramid, keeping their small secret, tended now and then by a creeping robot, still not fully understood. Rest a moment on that image, gently. A tiny stone door, with little copper handles, hidden deep inside a shaft the width of your hand in the heart of a mountain of stone, placed there 4,500 years ago and found again only in our own time by a small robot creeping up the dark channel. Whatever it was meant to seal, whatever it was meant to protect or conceal, it is still doing its work, still sealed, still keeping its secret after all these thousands of years. Now let us come to the great discovery of our own age, the one that has excited everyone because it shows that even now, even after all this time, the Great Pyramid has not given up all its secrets. For thousands of years, there was no way to see inside the solid parts of the pyramid. You could explore the known passages and chambers, but the vast bulk of the structure, the millions of tons of solid stone, was simply solid, unknowable, sealed. If there were hidden rooms buried in the mass of it, with no passage leading to them, there was no way anyone could ever know. You cannot dig through millions of tons of stone to check. The inside of the pyramid, its true inside, was beyond reach, and then in our own time physics gave us a way to see through solid stone, and the way it works is so strange and so beautiful that it is worth understanding gently as you drift. From space all the time, the Earth is being showered with particles, high-energy particles from the Sun and from the depths of the galaxy, striking the top of our atmosphere constantly. And when they strike the air high above us, they shatter and produce showers of other smaller particles which rain down toward the ground. Among these are particles called muons, which are a little like heavier cousins of the tiny particles that make up the outer parts of atoms. Muons are raining down on you right now, gently all the time, passing through your body, through the roof, through the ground, harmlessly, in vast numbers, every second of every day. You have never felt one. And they are passing through you as you rest. And here is the beautiful part. Muons can pass through solid rock, but not perfectly. As they travel through stone, some of them are absorbed, and the more stone they pass through, the more of them are stopped. So if you place a detector beneath or beside a great mass of stone and carefully count the muons arriving from each direction, you can measure how much stone lies in each direction. Where there is more stone, fewer muons get through. Where there is less stone or empty space, more muons arrive. It is very much like taking an X-ray, but on the scale of a mountain, and using particles from outer space instead of a machine. When a doctor takes an X-ray of your body, the rays pass more easily through soft tissue than through bone, and so the bones show up as shadows in the picture. This is the same idea, made enormous. The muons pass more easily through empty space than through solid stone, and so a hidden chamber shows up faintly as a bright place in the count, a spot where more particles came through than the solid rock should have allowed. A shadow picture of the inside of a pyramid, drawn by particles born in the collisions of cosmic rays high in the sky. And the wonderful thing is that it harms nothing. You do not touch the pyramid. You do not drill or dig or disturb a single stone. You simply place your detectors in the existing chambers or on the ground nearby, and you wait patiently for weeks and months while the muons rain down from the heavens as they always have, passing through the ancient stone, and you count them. And slowly, out of that patient counting, a map of the hidden interior begins to emerge. It is one of the gentlest ways imaginable of looking inside something so precious and so old. You let the sky do the work, and you simply watch. Do you see what that means? It means you can map the inside of a solid object without touching it, without drilling into it, simply by patiently counting the particles that rain down through it from the sky. A hidden empty space inside the stone would let more muons through and would show up faintly as a bright patch in the count, a place where more particles arrived than the solid stone alone could explain. It is a way of seeing through mountains using particles from outer space. And a few years ago, scientists placed these muon detectors inside and around the Great Pyramid, and they counted patiently for months the muons raining down through all that ancient stone. And they were looking to see whether the known chambers showed up correctly as a test, and they did. But then they saw something else, something nobody expected. High up in the pyramid, above the Grand Gallery, in a region of what everyone had assumed was solid stone, there was a bright patch in the muon count, a place where far more particles were arriving than solid rock could allow, which could mean only one thing. There was a great empty space up there hidden in the stone that no one had ever known about. Now, when a result like that first appears, scientists are rightly cautious. A single detector, a single strange reading could be a mistake, a flaw in the equipment, a trick of the counting. So they did what good science requires. They checked it and checked it again. They used different kinds of muon detectors, built by different teams, using different technologies placed in different positions, and every one of them independently saw the same thing. The bright patch was real. There was, beyond reasonable doubt, a large empty space hidden in the stone above the Grand Gallery, and it was not small. The void they detected is large, comparable in size to the Grand Gallery itself, a substantial empty space, perhaps 30 meters long, high in the heart of the pyramid, sealed in solid stone, with no known passage leading to it, undisturbed and unseen for 4,500 years. To have found something that big, in a monument studied so exhaustively for so long, was astonishing. It was as though someone had discovered a large hidden room in a house that had been lived in and mapped and measured for centuries, a room whose door had simply never been found. Rest a moment on that, and let the wonder of it settle. After all this time, after thousands of years of people exploring, measuring, studying, robbing, and marveling at the Great Pyramid, there was still a great room-sized emptiness hidden inside it that nobody knew was there. And it took particles from outer space, raining down through the stone to reveal it. And here is the wonderful thing. We still do not know what it is. Is it another chamber, deliberately built, with some sacred purpose we cannot guess? Is it a second Grand Gallery, a mirror of the one we know? Is it simply a structural void, another clever hollow space left by the builders to relieve the weight, like the relieving chambers above the king's chamber, but larger and never recorded? Is it empty or does it hold something? Nobody knows. It has no known entrance, No passage leads to it. It sits there in the dark, in the solid heart of the pyramid, exactly as the builders left it, and we have seen only its faint shadow in the count of falling particles. The cautious voices point out that it may be nothing dramatic. The builders left many gaps and hollows in the pyramid for structural reasons, and this may simply be a large one that happened never to be recorded, a construction feature rather than a hidden room full of treasure. That is probably the most likely explanation, and it would still be a genuine discovery, a new thing learned about how the pyramid was built. But the more romantic possibilities cannot be ruled out either, and that is part of what makes it so tantalizing. It could be a chamber that was deliberately sealed and hidden, its entrance so well concealed that 4,500 years of explorers never found it. And if it is a hidden sealed chamber, then unlike almost every other space in the pyramid, it might never have been robbed. Every known chamber was emptied long ago, but a room that no one ever found, that no robber ever reached, might still hold whatever was placed in it. Nobody is saying that is what it is, but nobody can say for certain that it is not, and that uncertainty is a rare and precious thing in our thoroughly mapped world. There is talk now of ways to look inside it without damaging the pyramid, of sending a tiny robot or a camera through a very small drilled hole or up through some existing shaft to peer at last into that hidden space. Perhaps in the coming years, someone will finally see what is in there, the first eyes to fall upon it in 4,500 years, or perhaps it will stay sealed and stay a mystery a little longer. Rest a moment on that, because it is a rare and lovely thing. In a world that can feel entirely mapped, entirely known, entirely explored, here is a great sealed room hidden in the most famous building on Earth that no one has ever seen and no one can yet explain. The Great Pyramid, 4,500 years old, studied more than almost any object in the world, still has a secret, still keeps something back, still holds, in its stone heart, a space of darkness that we have glimpsed but not entered. Now let me gather all of this together, the whole hidden interior, as we begin to come back toward rest. Inside the Great Pyramid, then, there is a whole hidden world, a long passage descending into the bedrock to an unfinished chamber, abandoned when the builders changed their plans. A passage climbing up, once sealed with granite. The soaring, breathtaking Grand Gallery, that cathedral of stone in the dark. The plain, magnificent King's Chamber of red granite with its empty stone box. The hidden relieving chambers above it, holding up the weight and holding the workers' painted names. The narrow shafts pointing to the stars with their tiny sealed doors. And now, high above it all, a great room-sized void discovered by particles from space that no one has ever seen. It is a far stranger, richer, more mysterious place inside than the simple triangular mountain it appears from without. And so much of it was hidden, sealed, meant never to be seen, that we are still, even now, finding our way through it, still discovering, still wondering. And I think there is something wonderful in that, and something restful too, at the end of a long day. That even the most famous, most studied, most visited monument in the world still holds mysteries, that there are still sealed rooms and hidden voids and tiny doors in the dark, waiting patiently in the heart of the stone. That the world is not yet entirely known, that wonder is not yet used up, that there are still secrets kept safely in old and quiet places, doing no harm, threatening no one, simply waiting in the dark to be found in their own good time. We live in an age that can feel as though everything has been discovered. The maps are all drawn, the photographs are all taken, every corner of the world has been visited and measured and shown, and there can be a kind of quiet sadness in that, a sense that the age of discovery is over, that there is nothing left to find. But the Great Pyramid gently tells us otherwise. Here, in the most looked-at building on Earth, right in plain sight, there was still a great hidden room that no one knew about until a few years ago, revealed by a technology we only recently learned to use. If the Great Pyramid can still surprise us, then the world is not so thoroughly known after all. There are still discoveries waiting, even in the most familiar places, for those patient enough and clever enough and curious enough to find them. And there is a gentleness in the way this secret was kept and found. The void harmed no one, sitting there in the dark for 45 centuries. And it was found not by force, not by tearing the pyramid open, but by patiently counting particles from the sky, by watching and waiting rather than breaking in. There is something fitting in that. The old monument kept its secret quietly, and we learned it quietly. And the pyramid stands today exactly as it stood, undamaged, still holding its mystery, only now we know a little more about what it holds. So let us come back now, gently, up out of the passages and the chambers, back through the sealed and silent spaces, back into the ordinary night. The pyramid stands there still tonight, as it has every night for 45 centuries, its hidden chambers dark and silent within it. The unfinished room deep in the rock, the soaring gallery, the empty granite box in the plain granite chamber, the little sealed doors in the narrow shafts, and the great unseen void, high in the stone, holding whatever it holds, keeping whatever it keeps, undisturbed as it has been since the builders sealed the pyramid and walked away 4,500 years ago. There is nothing in there that concerns you, nothing that needs watching or worrying over. It is simply an old and quiet place, full of old and quiet secrets resting in the dark, as it has for longer than almost anything else that human hands have made. The mysteries can keep. They have kept for 45 centuries. They will keep until morning and long after. So let your breathing slow and let the passages grow dark, and let the grand gallery fade into shadow, and let the empty granite box and the hidden void and the tiny sealed doors all settle into the deep quiet of the stone, where they have rested for so very long, and where they will rest still when you wake. There is nothing here you need to carry. The pyramid keeps its own secrets, and has done so faithfully for 4,500 years, and asks nothing of you at all. It will still be standing in the morning, silent and enormous and patient, its hidden chambers dark within it, keeping their long, quiet, undisturbed watch, exactly as they have through every night there has ever been since the builders sealed the door. Sleep now, and let the oldest wonder of the world keep its secrets in the dark, as it always has, needing nothing from you, guarding its quiet mysteries in the heart of the stone until the morning comes.